now that we've managed to successfully send our messages to our FlashChat database, it's time to get rid of our hard-coded dummy messages. So instead, let's retrieve our messages from our Firebase database and then create a message array using our real data. So remember when we created our message model, we're finally going to use it in order to structure the data that we get back from Firebase so that we can create a message object that contains both the sender and message body, which we've saved into our Firebase when we sent our message. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the top of our class file and we're going to declare a new variable. So it's going to be called message array. And it's going to be an array that is populated with message objects. So that's going to be the data type of this array. And we're going to set it to a completely empty array for now. It's just going to be an empty egg box holding no data in the beginning. And later, once we've retrieved data from Firebase, we'll populate this array. So in order to create a blank array, all we have to do is just write the square brackets, put in the data type that it should hold, and then we're going to use an empty set of parentheses to create a brand new array of message objects. So now we can create a method that retrieves the messages from Firebase. So one of the things you might have noticed is that in this code file, we've got a lot of these commented to-dos and also these marks. The reason why they're there is because it aids your navigation. When you click on this part where it says Chat View Controller, you can visualize quite easily your entire code file as a bunch of to-dos as well as pragma mark sections. So every single time you write the 2 forward slashes, capital, mark, and colon, and dash, then it sets out a new section. So for example, this corresponds to the table view data source methods mark. And then if you scroll further down, you'll have another one that corresponds to the text field delegate methods. And that means that we can have an overview of our entire code file of this really long chat view controller class. So here you can also see the to-dos, and the to-dos have a little symbol that looks a bit like a to-do list, right? So it's got bullet points next to it. And we're going to look for the one that says create the retrieved messages method here. And if you have a look, you can see that it says create the retrieved messages method here. And if you click on it, it'll take you straight to the place where you're meant to do this. So you can use this navigation a bit like an index, and it shows you the properties with a P and the methods using an M, so you can navigate to the methods that you want to go to, the to-dos that you need to do, and you can also split up your sections using these pragma marks. All right, so now that we found the place where we want to create the retrieve messages, let's go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna write retrieve messages, and it's again not going to take any inputs, but inside the curly braces we want to create a new constant called message db that is going to be a Firebase database.reference, and it's going to be a reference to our child database that is called messages, if you remember. So when we sent our messages, we referred to this child database called messages. And when we retrieve our messages, of course, we have to get the same reference to that same database. And just make sure that in the send part, if you sent it to a child database called messages, when you want to receive the messages, you have to have the exact same spelling, because otherwise it's going to try and tap into a different database. So just make sure that those two strings are identical so that we're sending and receiving from the same database. All right, so using that reference, we're going to ask Firebase to keep an eye out for any new data being added to this messages database. So in Firebase speak, what we're saying is that we are observing for the event type child added. So that refers to when there is a new message being put into the database. So that means that we're not constantly retrieving, we're only saying that when there is a new event, i.e. a new message was added to that database, then we want to grab the results of that database. So to do that in code, we're going to refer to this messages DB so this reference that we created, and we're going to write observe for event type with Snapshot. So this message that comes up. So the event type is going to be .child added. So that means whenever a new entry gets added into the messages database, and this parameter takes a closure. So we're going to open a set of curly braces, hit enter to insert the closing curly brace, and we are going to create a parameter to the Firebase snapshot that gets returned after this method completes. So we'll call it snapshot, and of course we need that key in word in order to make this a closure. So between the closing brace and the in keyword is going to be the body of our closure, and in here we want to grab the data inside this snapshot and format it into a custom message object. So it's going to have a sender and a message body. So this closure will get called whenever a new item has been added to our messages database. And it returns a snapshot, i.e. a snapshot of that database. And the snapshot has a whole bunch of properties like does it exist, what is the children count, the children, has children. But the one that we want is this value. And this will contain all the values that are inside that database. But the problem is that value has a data type of any question mark. And this is something that came from Objective-C. To some extent, you can say that programming in Swift to build iOS apps feels a bit like putting together like a Frankenstein monster, because there are some things that they had to put in there to make sure that everything is still backwards compatible with a lot of the APIs that were written in Objective-C. So a large part of the libraries that we're using, say UIKit or Foundation, are still written in Objective-C, and they basically had to put in some syntactic sugar in order to make sure that everything still works when you're writing Swift code. So this is one of those things, and this data type any is literally that. It's any data type, and that isn't very helpful because our compiler won't know what it can do with an object of any data type. So we have to convert it or cast it into a known data type. And the thing is, we know what that data type is. It's a dictionary. And the reason why we know it is because we were the ones who put it in there. We put a dictionary in there, and we set the value of this child in the messages database to be a dictionary. So when we're taking that data out of the database, we also know that that data should be a dictionary. So let's go ahead and cast it. So I'm going to create a constant to store the post-casting result, and it's going to be called snapshot value. It's going to be equal to snapshot dot value, and it is going to, and we're going to convert its data type from, at the moment, it's optional any, to a real data type that we can work with. And we're going to do that using the as keyword. So we're saying that treat this data as a dictionary. And we have to also specify what are the data types of the items in the dictionary. So what is the data type of the key in the dictionary, and what's the data type of the value? So if we have a look back here, the keys that we've put into our dictionary are both strings, and the values are also both strings. One is a string that represents the email of the current user, and one is a string representing the text that was inside the message text field. So our dictionary's format is a string as a key and strings as values. So this is how we can represent our data type of our dictionary. So now we can use this snapshot value and tap into its strings. So we can create a constant called text, and we can set that to equal snapshot value, and we want to grab the value under the key message body, because that's the text that we're going to put into our table view. So we just put in the key, and we know it's called message body, and it should pull out the value as a optional string. So at the moment, if you have a look, text has the data type of an optional string. So to make that a real string, we will unwrap it. And it's safe to do so because we know that every single time we send a message, the sender and message body both will have values. And also, this closure only gets triggered when our database has a new child added to the database. So when a new message gets added to that database, then this closure triggers. It doesn't trigger when that database is empty or nothing's happening. So we should be safe in unwrapping this. The other thing that we want to pull out of that snapshot value is, of course, the sender. And that's going to equal the snapshot value, and we're going to pull out the item under the key sender. And again, I'm going to unwrap it. And now I'm going to print these two items to the console so that we can see, as developers, what are the values that are held in those two constants. So now all we need to do is to call this retrieve messages method, and we're going to do that right at the bottom of our view did load. So just after where it says configure table view, we're going to call retrieve messages. So now let's run our app and see what happens when we send a message to our database. All right, so I'm going to send a message, say hello, for example, and I'm going to hit send. And now we get printed in the console the text, which is hello, and the sender, which is that testing email. So everything is working as expected. So great, we're able to monitor for new data that's going into our database, and we're able to tap into that new data and print it to the console. So that's pretty awesome. Well, now all we need to do is, instead of printing these two items, we want to save them into a message object. And we want to structure our message object with a sender and a message body. So all you need to do is create a new message object, and we're going to set its properties to the text and sender that we get back from our Firebase database. As a challenge, pause the video and see if you can do that. All right, so first we have to delete this print statement. We don't want it to be triggered all the time. And then we're going to create a new object called message, and it's going to be constructed from the message class. And the message object has two properties. One is called the message body, which we're going to set as the text that we got back from Firebase. And it also has a sender property, which we're going to set to the sender that we get back from Firebase. So now we have a message object, and that is going to be added to, and we're going to add that message object to our message array. So at the moment, the message array is an empty array that can only receive message objects. And now we're going to append this message object into that array. As we get more and more messages, each message will get added into this message array, and we will have an array of message objects that contains everything that's ever been sent in our FlashChat app. So we're going to refer to our message array using the self keyword, because remember we're inside a closure, and we're going to write message array dot append. And the new element that we want to append is, of course, this message object. And there shouldn't be any problems because message array is an array that takes message objects, and this message is, of course, a message object. Okay, so I've just said the word message about 1 million times, but essentially you get the gist. We're using this message class to structure our messages, and we're adding them to this array so that we can pull them out at a later stage. So to complete this retrieve messages method, the next thing that we need to do is we need to call configure table view. So if you remember, if we have a look at our little index and we have a look and find our configure table view, it resets the height of each row in our message table view to fit the content of the messages. And because we're putting in new data, we're putting in the messages that we got back from our cloud database, we need to reformat the table view. So at the end of retrieve messages, we're going to write self, and we're going to configure table view. And we also need to reload the data in our message table view. To do that, we write self.message table view dot reload data. So that means every single time we add new data to our messages database, it will trigger this event where a new child is added, which means that this closure will get called. And every single time there's new data in the database, we will need to reload the message table view with new data so that it reflects the data that gets added. So now all we need to do is to put in the real data into our database instead of our dummy data inside this message array. So we can go ahead and just delete these two lines, and instead we're going to use our message array that we created up here that's populated with real messages from our database. So just below where we've created our blank cell, we're going to set some of its properties. Firstly, we're going to set its message body, and that is going to be set to equal message array with item at index path dot row. So as we said before, this method gets called for every single cell in the table view. And each time we have a different index path being passed in here. So when we're looking for the data for row 1, then this index path.row is going to be equal to 0, in which case we grab the 0th element in our message array. And of course, the message array has message objects, so they will have a message body property. And that message body becomes the message body of the cell. We're going to do the same for the sender. So cell.sender username.text equals message array at index path.row, and we're going to tap into the sender property this time. Now the last thing we want to do is we want to put an image inside that avatar image name. Now, as you've seen on Twitter or on Facebook, when a user hasn't set their profile photo, they usually get a default photo. So being inspired by Twitter, we are using an egg as the avatar image. So let's go ahead and set the cell's avatar image views image property to a UI image that is named egg. So that's what we called it over here, and that's what we're going to refer to it by. So here we've populated the message body property, the sender username, and the avatar image view in our custom message cell so that it's going to display some real data from our Firebase database. Now, another thing that we need to remember to do is that, do you remember this method where it asks for how many rows you want in your table? Well, at the moment, we're putting in 3 because we only had 3 dummy messages. Now, if we ran this app right now, it will crash because we're saying that it has 3 cells, but currently in our Firebase, we've only got 1 message. So our message array only contains 1 object. So what is the data going to be for the second cell and the third cell? Well, if you're not going to provide it, then your app is going to crash. So instead of just hard coding this with a number, we want to return the count of our message array. So if there's 3 objects in our message array, then we want to have 3 cells. If there's 4 objects, we want to have 4 cells, etc. All right, so now let's run our app and see what happens. All right, so let's go ahead and enter a new message. Let's say, hello world, maybe. Hit send. Oh, there it is. We've populated the message body. We've added in the user email of the person who typed that message, and we've also got a little egg as our avatar image. So that's awesome. We've managed to send data and retrieve data from our Firebase database.